Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with another Q&A. Without any further ado, let's hop right into it. Our first question comes from Zarguz Headwaka, who asks, is there a limit to how big the Tomb Kings can build their constructs? Say for example, if you had an amazing necrotech with an abundance of souls, would the Tomb Kings be able to create titans, or is there another factor stopping this from happening? So, the largest issue that stands between the Tomb Kings and creating colossal constructs is that it requires an incredible amount of magic to animate such monstrosities. The largest constructs buried in Nehekhara are horrifically powerful creations known to scholars as Chimeric Titans. These castle-sized creatures of precious stone and gems were made long ago during the absolute height of Nehekhara's power by the most gifted of necrotechs and the Lich Priests. Bound within to animate them is usually the soul of a legendary warrior, but there are a few that contain the remains of an entire dynasty of warrior kin, who gave their lives so that they might guard the great land for all eternity. A notable flaw of the Chimeric Titan, though, is that they are rarely active, as due to their immense size and the rites used to animate them, the Titans require incredible amounts of magic to awaken. However, such is the perfection of their creation, that should a storm of magic pass their resting place, these guardians will fully activate without the assistance of either Lich Priest or Necrotech. So it's certainly possible to make Titan-sized constructs, there's just a number of flaws and reasons why they're not exactly the most ideal selection. Hope that answers your question. Let's go on to the next one. Our second question comes from Demon Dave, who asks, I think that I remembered the Tomb Kings have one city with living people in it. What was it called? How do they live under their dead kings/queens? So, in an older edition of the Tomb Kings lore, I believe it was either the Lords of Qatar or Numus that allowed the living to serve them within their city. Though in the modern edition, they've basically done away with this notion. In 8th edition, which is the final one for Warhammer Fantasy, the Tomb Kings are incredibly envious of the living while simultaneously looking down upon them, and they strongly endeavor to keep the land of the dead true to its name. No living creature is welcome within the cities of the Tomb Kings any longer, and those who try to enter will only find death. Great Book of Grudges asks, do Tomb Kings still worship the other gods of the Nehekharan pantheon? The Tomb Kings do still worship the full pantheon of Nehekhara, even in Undeath, though due to the machinations of Nagash, the pantheon was greatly weakened. Usirian, god of the underworld, became the most powerful as all of Nehekhara became part of his realm, and all paid fealty to the god whom without the Tomb Kings could not exist. Many of the other gods have faded into mere shadows of their former glory, as the worship of the stagnant undead is paltry compared to that of the living, though their artifacts and constructs, blessed by the various gods, remain strong to this day. It should be worth noting that most of the desert gods were gravely wounded or weakened during the Great War against Nagash, as many of them rallied behind Tra to fight the Great Necromancer by unleashing their greatest guardians and creatures upon him. Sadly, none were able to defeat Nagash, and he used his foul necromancy to twist many of the gods' creations into horrible parodies to serve himself. The most notable case of this was the winged warriors of Tra being turned into the abominations of Nagash, now known as Morghasts. Our next question comes from Luke Arsiguel, who asks, can Chaos corrupt a Tomb King? Theoretically, it could happen, as Tomb Kings still have souls, but the undead hold little interest for the Dark Brothers. Another issue is that Usirian controls the realm of souls, which is central to the process of how the Tomb Kings return from death to walk the mortal plane once more. If turned to Chaos, the god of the underworld would not suffer their betrayal, so they'd quickly find themselves isolated, and when killed would be cast into the depths of the underworld to be repeatedly devoured by the dread abyssals for all eternity. Plus, the Tomb Kings are so unbelievably arrogant that every time the gods of Chaos have tried to make an offer, it's been taken as an insult by the undead monarchs. The Dark Gods ask for their supplicants to serve above all else, and that tends to be the one thing that most Tomb Kings would rather face oblivion than do. In the end times, we did see numerous vampires give themselves over to chaos, but all the Tomb Kings refused any effort made by the Dark Brothers. So I would say for them, it's possible, but they're typically, the way they're designed and their personalities and such, it would be a no. Our fifth question comes from Richard Brown, who asks, can Tomb Kings use the souls of Nehekarans to animate normal human skeletons, like how they are used to occupy constructs, or can a soul occupy only their old body? So the answer is no. The souls of Nehekarans can only return to their original mortal forms. This is why the constructs in part tend to be so large, as the remains of the one animating them are always contained somewhere within the actual statue. There are, of course, constructs powered by other more mysterious forces, such as the Necrosphinxes, but most are controlled by a fallen Nehekaran. This is easily visible in the likes of the Tomb Scorpion, which are animated by the deceased Lich Priests you can see on their actual backs. In the case of Ushabti and Necropolis Knights, for instance, the souls animating them had their mortal remains interred beneath or nearby the statue's resting place, and bound to them by powerful rituals of the Lich Priests. Should a skeleton warrior's body become somehow beyond repair, even by the magic of the priesthood, their remains will be used to animate the sepulchral stalkers that guard the borders of the Great Land. In any event, every soul contained within the realm of souls can only animate their original body or a construct their remains were painstakingly bound to. They can't just be dragged out and thrown into the nearest skeleton. Another question from Richard is, if some theories are correct and the realm of Usirian and Mor are the same, can the Tomb Kings raise non-Nehekarans into their old skeletal bodies for use in any Tomb King army? For example, wasn't the Herald of Setra a non-Nehekaran, but he can still be raised? So, the different gods of death have their own realms within the afterlife, much like how the different Chaos gods have their own spaces within the realm of Chaos. It is likely there may be a way to branch from Usirian's underworld into the grey world of Mor, but the two are very distinct and different places. The Lich Priests cannot raise any using their lore, except those whose souls reside in the realm of souls, which is very specifically Usirian's domain. The only way to end up there is to have been one that believed in and worshipped Usirian, with those having rites performed upon them by the mortuary cult having the privilege to rest higher up than those who were cast into the depths. While Usirian allows the souls of the dead to enter and leave his realm at the discretion of the Lich Priests, Mor is considered a jealous god who refuses to let a single person leave his domain. Necromancers and vampires that steal from Mor have to be cautious, as the old world's reigning god of death will swiftly strike down any he catches pilfering from his realm. As for Nakoth in particular, remember he was mummified alive to be buried alongside Setra and had an incredible amount of rites performed upon his body to ensure his resurrection. It doesn't matter where or how you were born in the Warhammer world. When you die, your destination is determined by what you believed in and the rituals performed upon your corpse after your death. Hopefully that answers your question there. For question number 7, we have from Drathella Chilmain, also known as Izzy, who asks, say I'm part of an expedition in the Badlands, and we somehow walk past the sepulchral stalkers guarding the border. When the Tomb Kings notice I'm there, what exactly is the military response? So it will be a pretty swift and brutal response, as the buried legions nearby will essentially just start raising up immediately to attack whatever interloper has entered their domain. Skeletons will burst from underneath the dunes and crawl out before forming into ranks, chariots and cavalry will emerge at full speed from their hidden graves, and constructs lying beneath will explode amongst the enemy to wreak carnage. Should the expedition be a notably large or skilled force able to survive such ambushes, they will immediately attract the attention of the Lich Priests of the nearest city, as the dead of the desert begin to stir. This would prompt the priest to notify the currently awakened Tomb Kings, who would then send out what they consider to be the appropriate response force. Long story short though, if you get noticed in the Land of the Dead, you won't be living much longer. Misha asks, How advanced are the Tomb King's soldiers, given how they reuse the same bodies again and again, rather than raising new ones like the vampire counts? So, amusingly enough, the soldiers of the Tomb Kings tend to be much more advanced than those of the vampire counts, precisely because of this reason. When the Lich Priest summoned the skeletal legions, every single being that awakens was a dedicated and trained warrior in life. Even the lowest rank of skeleton warrior who received the least ritual preparation at their death has retained all of their training and skill that they once possessed in life, though it's a tad hazy and slow for them unless a Lich Priest or Tomb King or Prince targets them to full wakefulness. The vampire counts, on the other hand, raise most of their minions as mere puppets, extensions of their own will that only have the faintest hints of skill or instincts. This is the case for anything below the tier of Graveguard or the living creatures found within their ranks like ghouls and crypt horrors. How often a body is raised has no effect on its skill or abilities. It has much more to do with the level of sorcery used to raise said corpse than anything else. But whereas the Tomb King undead were specifically designed to be raised, the vampire count undead, they tend to just kind of grab whatever the cheapest material is nearby, which is why zombies and skeletons, for instance, in the vampire count's armies are very, very weak and not really the best soldiers. They tend to rely much more on mass and sheer numbers than any skill or formation that you might see over in like Nehekara. Our next question comes from Cold Rage, who asks, how did Nagash make necromancy? So, Nagash created the foul art of necromancy by combining the rituals of the mortuary cult, the lore of Nehekara, the lore of death, and the lore of dark magic into a horrible amalgamation that allowed him to commit terrible atrocities. The key to his discovery was a group of dark elves that had wrecked upon the shores of Nehekara who were captured and imprisoned by Nagash. One amongst their number was a sorceress who taught Nagash the art of dark magic, and then because of when he was born, he had been basically given over the mortuary cult and had become essentially a high priest and was very, very skilled in their arts. So he was sort of able to combine all of this information through his own genius and created a new lore of magic, being the lore of necromancy, which of course had a very dramatic impact on the world from that point forward. Question 10 comes from the Guardian of Metal, who asks, just had this question cross my mind. Assuming the Tomb Kings did get their golden bodies, how do you think they would interact with the rest of the world? For Cetra, it's rather clear in that he would continue trying to conquer everything, but what about the average Tomb King? So, for the Tomb Kings, you have to remember that all they care about is themselves and their legacy. And by legacy, I mean their bragging rights. Hence why all Tomb Kings and Princes have an absurdly long list of titles upon introduction instead of just their name. They believe themselves superior to all other nations and races, and had they come back as intended in the form of living golden immortals, most of them would just immediately resume conquering and warring against the wider world and each other. Cetra, of course, would have begun his reign of 1,000,000 years, and likely would have forced all the other Tomb Kings under him before beginning his conquest of the entire world. If they had resurrected properly, though, it's worth noting the Tomb Kings would have been living immortals, able to enjoy the many pleasures of life instead of the undead husks they became. Perhaps they would have been kinder or more easily distracted by life's many temptations and pleasures in this event, and they certainly would have been more likely to bargain or trade with the other human empires, as they wouldn't have been the envious undead who generally just kind of hate all life that we see in the actual Warhammer world. But, of course, that unfortunately for all of them was not the case. They instead came back as something not quite as intended. Our next question comes from Apollo Potato, who asks, back to the good old human Nehekara days, what were their interactions with the Lizardmen? So, from what texts we have, it seems that they tended to fight against one another a fair deal. The Nehekarans love rare metals and precious stones just as much as modern men do, and likely raided the Southlands often to sate their greed. Of course, this would have incurred the wrath of the Lizardmen fairly often, especially as the occasional sacred plaque was likely often nicked alongside other treasures. It is worth noting, however, that when Nagash unleashed his legions of undead and the Nehekarans fought against him, the Lizardmen of the Southlands did march north to fight alongside the living against what they likely considered a massive deviation from the Great Plan. So at least for some short while, they were allies before Nagash unleashed his plague of death and killed the land of Nehekara. It may have been that the Lizardmen of the Southlands might have had a small trading relationship with at least some of the Tomb Cities. Nehekara was the first great nation of men, so they are the closest in creation and distance to what the old ones kind of had in mind when they made humanity. And many texts kind of have Nehekarans being, they were built a little differently than the average human. They tended to be a little ways just better in a lot of ways, taller, stronger, faster. So the Lizardmen might have been more tolerant of the Nehekarans than, say, the Lustrians. Lustrian Lizardmen were of the humans that came to them, because that was a much greater issue with the Great Plan, because those were humans that were very, very far away from where they were supposed to be, whereas the Nehekarans were in their birthplace, and they were where they're supposed to be. So the Southlands Slann might have had a little bit more tolerance towards them. For question 12, we come back to Drothella Chillmane, who asks, how many Tomb Kings like Settra may be Priest Kings and therefore retain some magical ability? So, Settra the Imperishable was the only Tomb King to ever manage having any magical prowess due to his obsession with being all-powerful. He didn't want the Lich Priest to have magic, being able to dangle it over his head, so he did everything he could to master magic so that he basically they wouldn't have that bargaining chip against him. Though Settra was not a very good wizard. He was very remedial at best, which frustrated him to no end. The title of Priest King doesn't mean they're capable of using magic. It means that the king in question had the support of the Nehekaran pantheon and was therefore a divine ruler beyond question. Settra attained the title of the first Priest King after he sacrificed his own children to please the gods and earned their favor in a very obvious ritual where the gods rewarded him with a bunch of rain after Nehekara had been in a drought for a super long time. And all of a sudden they had abundant food, and all this terrible disease that had been infecting Khemri was washed away by the rains. So it was very obvious that the sacrifice went over well. And that's why he became called the Priest King. And any Priest King afterwards was someone that basically was believed to have the favor of the pantheon. It did not mean that they were a priest in the Lich Priest sense. It meant that they were a priest in the god sense. Zeta Prime asks, how rare is it for a Tomb King to travel to any settlement other than their factions? Fairly rare. The Tomb Kings never leave their domain unless it's on a specific mission of reclamation or vengeance. Due to Settra's decree that most of them should remain asleep in their sarcophagi until awakened, there usually aren't enough Tomb Kings or princes active to really warrant traveling outside the land of the dead except for war. Also, they don't trade or deal with other nations, as being undead they don't actually require anything of note, so they generally just hang around working tirelessly to restore Nehekara until there's a need for bloodshed. When you say faction in your question, I assume you mean race, so travel any settlement other than other Tomb Kings. If you mean faction as in actual city, then yeah, they travel to each other's cities all the time for negotiations, trade. Each of the Tomb Kings usually has a long line of diplomats from various Tomb cities that are just waiting to be recognized and talked to. It's pretty straightforward, and most of them don't have too many issues with each other. The Tomb Kings have a very heavy diplomatic system that's very convoluted, long-winded, and it takes forever for them to do a lot of things. But thankfully, they're undead, so they have plenty of time. And today's final question comes from Kenovia, who asks, I know the common folk are basically just automatons, only the nobility and priests being truly sentient. Are there any exceptions? Any common folk who retain their minds through force of will or something? Also, how much peaceful contact do Tomb Kings have with other factions? This is technically 2 questions, but that's okay. The only way for the undead of Nehekhara to retain anything other than basic skills needed to perform their role was for the mortuary cult to have performed special rituals on them at the time of embalming. This wasn't done for the likes of basic soldiers, construction workers, etc., but many of the personal attendants to the various kings, and of course their families, were often tended to with extra care. As such, most of them, when awakened, have a fair amount of their original minds and personalities. There's no true exceptions to this rule, as it's a fairly straightforward system, and force of will alone is meaningless when returning to your body from the realm of souls. The process of being dragged back, it's not so much that they're just complete automatons, it's more of that they're kind of in this really hazy fog when they're in the land of the living, and the only things that remain crystal clear are basically their most pertinent functions. So if it's like a skeleton warrior, their ability to fight and follow orders and stay in ranks and stuff like that, or if it's a former slave worker, then their ability to take orders from the necrotect and vice versa, or not vice versa, but other things like that. Vice versa. As for peaceful contact, that's basically non-existent for the Tomb Kings. The only time the Tomb Kings contact other nations is for war, whether it be against the race in question or a mutual enemy. So there have been times where, they have marched all the way up to the Empire to fight like Zacharias the Ever-Living alongside the Empire, for instance. But the Tomb Kings don't really bother much with peaceful negotiations. We kind of talked about it earlier a bit, in that they kind of view everyone as beneath them anyway, and they can't stand the living most of the time. So no, they don't really like to talk to all the other nations in the Warhammer world. And if they're coming to see you, 9 times out of 10 it's because you have something of theirs and they're coming to take it back, which is not going to be a pleasant experience at all. So hopefully that answers that question as well. Alright, so that will wrap up today's Q&A video. Sorry it's not on Sunday this week with the early access stuff, which I'm sure many of you have seen either the live stream or the videos. Things have been just absolutely crazy. So thank you for your patience on that. But so next week we're going to be doing the Beastmen, as that's what the patrons voted for over on Patreon. It was a very close vote between Beastmen and Norska, so chances are we'll be doing Norska the week after that. But in any event, leave all your questions for the Beastmen Q&A down below. We gathered, I think we answered 14 questions for this one. I'd like to answer more if possible, so feel free to leave anything you can think of when it comes to Beastmen down below. I do want to take a moment to thank all of my patrons for their generous support and helping me out in every way that they, in that little way that they can, which, or for some, it's a big way. I also want to thank everyone who's been joining me on the live streams, where we've received some very generous donations this week, particularly from Justin Mackey. So thanks to everyone who showed up to that and watched or donated or just showed up or just dropped a like. All those things help. And then of course I do want to give a special shout out to Sign of the Emperor and Rilana for their especially generous patron levels. So thanks again to you two for your continued very incredible support. So yeah, that pretty much wraps us up for today. Hope you're all having a great time. More stuff coming in the future. We will be back for Sundays for Q&A Sunday, and it's not every 2 weeks, it's every week. So we'll be back this upcoming Sunday with the Beastmen. So if you want your question answered, you can leave it down in the comment section below here. You can tweet me the question on Twitter, or you can leave it in my Discord channel. There will be a Q&A section, you'll see it. And if you're a patron, of course, you can leave it on the Patreon page where I will post this video, and your questions will always have priority. So in any event, thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you around, especially for next week. Beastmen! Anyway, have a good day. Bye.